begin. My name is John Jordan, and I'm the director, the co-director actually, of the Dickens project, which is located at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And the Pickwick Club is a book club that is in part sponsored by the Dickens project. And we are in our third year, I think. Courtney, is it our fourth year? I can't remember exactly. But I want to welcome all of you. There are many familiar faces and familiar names that I see on the screen. And Courtney is Courtney Mahaney, who is waving there and who spoke a few minutes ago, is the assistant director of the Dickens Project. And this year, the Pickwick Club is doing something slightly different. In the past, the book club has usually dealt with several novels during the academic calendar year. But this year, we're trying a different format. We will be reading Great Expectations across the entire year, beginning in September and running until May or probably also June. But we have a reading schedule that stretches over 8 months. And so there will be sessions with smaller reading segments that will go from September, this is our first session, through May, and we'll probably have a June wrap-up meeting as well. So this means that we will be reading Great Expectations once a month for 8 or 9 months. And one thing that is a little bit different from the other years of the Pickwick Club is that in the past we have had a single leader who led the group through the entire discussion of a single novel. But this time, we're going to spread the leadership among the participants. So we will ask for volunteers to help us organize the reading schedule. And our president, the president of the Pickwick Club, is Wayne Batten, and Wayne has organized the first few sessions, so I will eventually turn things over to Wayne to introduce the format and the program. But that's the plan of work, and the.
I'm not. What do you?
Are you here, Wayne? Has Wayne signed up?
What are you looking for?
Yeah.
For something on the top.
Yes.
Something on
Oh,
here.
I got it. It's
people are
fine.
people are still.
All right.
Thank
People
you.
are still signing on, so
Okay.
another few minutes.
I have 2 more questions. It's Carl from Baltimore. 1, don't tell me the score of the Ravens game because it's going on now. Okay? Not that I really care. The other question I have is, I have 3 screens of people. Is this everybody that's going to be involved, or are there different groups going on? In other words, is this us right now?
This is us right now.
That's not very good English, but this is us. Okay.
It's not good English.
Thank you, John. I haven't been to Santa Cruz for a couple of years because of COVID, but thank you for doing this. And I know one thing about Courtney is she doesn't have a wood stove, and she's very disappointed about that. We've talked many occasions about that. So I will shut up now.
Thank you, Carl. And we're again just filling time for everyone to log on for a few more minutes, but it's my hunch that everyone or almost everyone has read Great Expectations before. Is there anyone who has never read Great Expectations and who has the wonderful experience of reading it for the first time? If you are, wave your hand. I see no hand. There's at least one hand. Rick is waving his hand. So we will do our best not to give away things that will happen later on. Now, inevitably, that's going to slip past our best intentions. But let's pretend, to the extent that we can, that we are reading this novel in a version of the original serial format. And Wayne has organized the first session for us to read and to discuss chapters 1 through 9 in book 1. Great Expectations, as I think most of you know, was published serially in Dickens's journal, the second journal that he, magazine that he edited, called All the Year Round. And it began in December of 1860, and it ran through August of 1861. And it's, I forget which novel, but it's late in Dickens's career. It's something like his 11th novel. Someone can correct me on that if they know better. But so we are reading it not in exactly the serial format that took Dickens a year to publish, but in a version of that. So with modifications to fit into our schedule. Great Expectations originally was published in that magazine in weekly installments. And this means the weekly serialization is different from the monthly serial format that Dickens used for most of his novels, for the very long ones. As a result, Great Expectations is a little bit shorter. It's in a modern Penguin type edition. It's only 450, 500 pages long, as opposed to the 800-page novels like Bleak House and Our Mutual Friend. And it also means that the chapters are shorter. The chapters in the monthly serialization are much longer. And so there's a condensation in Great Expectations that I think is a little bit unfamiliar if you've read those longer novels. And the result is a kind of compression, a tightness, I think, of plot and of structure and of organization. And it's also a result of the fact that Great Expectations has a single first-person narrator. And there's only one other novel, David Copperfield, and of course part of Bleak House that has a first-person narrator among the novels. So that concentration on the life and experience of a young boy, as the novel begins, Philip Pirrip, who grows up to become a man. That's basically the organizational structure. It's the life story of the narrator who's writing a kind of autobiography. So is Wayne here? I want to.
Yes.
Yes, Wayne. I've said a few things about Great Expectations and about the plan for the rest of this year. Is there anything that you, as the president of the Pickwick Club, would like to add before we launch into the discussion of chapters 1 through 9 at the beginning of the novel?
You can hear me, okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I have to tell a brief history of my attempt to teach Dickens in a serial format at the prep school where I taught. My first effort was A Tale of Two Cities. Of course, it too was published in All the Year Round, and I taught that over the entire year. My second effort was Great Expectations, which I thought we would teach in a somewhat abbreviated serial format, maybe for one semester. On both counts, I found it very difficult to get back to or persuade people the serial format was a good deal. but I remain hopeful anyway that it still works. Yes, I have another anecdote. That is, some years ago, I directed the teacher's workshop at the Dickens universe. And I think it was about my second effort. I had an attendee who was your classic student from hell, although an adult, because the subject that year was A Tale of Two Cities. And this attendee, who will go unnamed, kept saying, yes, but isn't Great Expectations better? And I kept saying, well, maybe it is, but the topic this year is A Tale of Two Cities. So anyway, yes, I'm delighted to be here starting out Great Expectations.
Okay, well, Wayne, shall I turn things over to you to get us started in talking about the first 9 chapters?
If you like.
Okay.
Well, secondly, I would very much like to thank Courtney Mulhaney, who is really wonderful. I could not do this if it were not for her. She organizes things and just does a wonderful job. So are you there, Courtney? No?
Yes, Courtney is there.
I
Okay.
am. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Well, I'll ask your advice. Should we begin with the clip of Miss Havisham? This is a way is because our reading ends with Pip's first visit to Miss Havisham. This would make sense, I think. Okay, great. Great.
Who is it? Pip, Mom.
Pip?
Pumbletree's boy. Come to play.
Ah. Ah, yes. Come here. Let me look at you. Look at me. You're not afraid of a woman who's never seen the sun since you were born.
No, Mum.
Then come closer. Now, I sometimes have sick fancies, and I have a sick fancy that I want to see some play. So, play. Go on, play. Play. Are you sullen and obstinate?
No, Mum. Very sorry for you, and I'm sorry that he can't play, but if you complain to me, I'll get into trouble with my sister. So I would play if I could, but it's just so nowhere.
Call Estella.
Estella! Estella!
Your own one day, my dear. You will use it well. Now, let me see you play cards with him. But he's a common neighbouring boy. You can break his heart.
What do you play, boy? Nothing but pick him a neighbour, miss.
So? Break at him.
Jack of diamonds.
Jack. Calls the knaves Jack, this boy. What coarse hands he has. What thick boots? He's nothing but a stupid, clumsy labouring boy.
What do you think of her? You say nothing of her.
I don't know what to say.
Whisper in my ear. What do you think?
I think she's very proud.
Anything else?
I think she's very pretty.
Anything else?
I think she's very insulting. I think I'd like to go home.
What? And never see her again.
I think I'd like to see her again.
Then you shall. Then you shall. But when? When shall I have you here again?
Today's Wednesday.
No Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays here. No days of the week and no weeks of the year. No, come again after 6 nights and Estella, take him down. Feed him.
Thanks so much for arranging that, Courtney. I don't know if you remember Helena Bonham Carter, who plays Miss Havisham, is still a great beauty. She was in a lot of Merchant Ivory movies in the 1980s. There is some excuse for having her play the part. Miss Havisham probably is in her 40s. Maybe some of you have a closer take on that. There is a wonderful article on the chronology of Great Expectations, which I could not get to you. It's by Jerome Meckler, and it is goes into quite a lot of detail. But anyway, I think the movie maker here went with the idea of a younger Miss Havisham. I really like this rendition. Would anyone like to comment on it first?
Turner Classics yesterday was doing a bunch of Dickens. So they did Oliver Twist, they did Great Expectations, and one other. And the one version I saw yesterday on Turner Classics was in black and white entirely. And the Mrs. Havisham, I don't know who plays her in that one, is really very, very, very shabby. But anyway, I don't know how many film versions. I belong to a Dickens Society in Baltimore, and we have a colleague who knows every single film version ever of every Dickens novel. So there is a Turner Classic. I'm sorry, there was one on Turner Classic yesterday. It was completely in black and white. And Mrs. Havisham, the difference in this one is Estella looks much prettier in this one. And Mrs. Havisham really looks like a train wreck. Not that she doesn't in what you just showed, but she really looks like an unbelievable train wreck in that other one.
Yeah.
So
I think she looked quite beautiful, Helena Bonnet. And how did she keep her eyeliner on so good?
Good question. Yeah.
I mean, I have a practical
She's
question.
been cheating.
What?
She's been cheating, putting on makeup, refreshing her makeup.
Yeah, my favorite is the original David Lean. But I have a question. It's a practical question. So here she's wearing the same wedding dress for 20 years, and it's still kind of intact. Does she take it off every night when she goes to bed and then puts it back on? I mean, I was just curious about that.
Well, also in the text, it says that her body has shrunk and that the dress no longer fits her very well. And that's, we're not going to do that to Helena Bonham Carter, are we? So, there's a discrepancy there as well.
I can add a note about the dress. This is actually supposed to be 1805 or 1807.
Uh-huh.
But before silk makers started filling silk, the true pure silk does not deteriorate unless it's subjected to sunlight, by the way. So it's quite possible for a silk wedding dress to last for decades at this period in time anyway, last intact.
Yeah.
I hate to bring up the idea, but let's get down to business. There are bodily functions. Bill Cosby used to say wanting and chewing, so I assume she did wanting and chewing from time to time. So I think she got out of the dress quite often.
Well, that is an eternal question about hoop dresses and thousands and thousands of underskirts. I mean, how does one manipulate all that?
Hoop skirts.
Yes, Miss Havisham would have used a chamber pot.
Later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
She would have used a chamber shop pot, and like my parents, who were born in the early 20th century, they took baths with a basin, with a sponge and washcloth.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably what she does.
Yeah.
What do you think about the seductiveness of Miss Havisham in this version? Does that work for her character or not?
I don't think of her as being terribly seductive, and she does not wish to be.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there would be no desire on her part to be attractive.
I think she's miscast. She's far too glamorous, too beautiful.
Okay.
There's about a half a dozen Dickens renditions, film renditions of this.
Yeah.
And is the black and white you saw with Alec Guinness, or is that the David?
Yeah.
Lean? Yeah.
That's the David Lean one. Yeah.
And I think in every one of them, I went on a kick one summer. She gets more and more as we get more closer to our time. She gets more glamorous because less true to the novel. In my version of it, she should look like the train wreck. I mean, my God, look at her life. Yeah, I love Helena Bonham Carter. I mean, did you know she's a great something granddaughter of a prime minister? What's his name? Asquith? Is there a prime minister named Asquith or something like that? Yeah, she's got breeding, so they in England.
I was interested that she was when we first saw her as Helena Bonham Carter here. When we first saw her, she was looking in her mirror, and when he left, she was looking in her mirror. I did not think that this happened in the book so much, so that might explain the eyeshadow. She's refreshing it continually.
Yeah. I don't think she wanted to look at herself in the mirror.
I have a slightly different take on the question of film adaptations. I think starting with a film adaptation of the novel needs to remind us that every film adaptation is an interpretation of the novel.
Thank you, John.
And so, yes, there will be different versions of Miss Havisham. There'll be different Pips. There'll be different Estellas. And we're reading the novel. And the original readers of the novel didn't even have illustrations. Many of Dickens's novels were accompanied in their original format by illustrations, and Dickens worked closely with his illustrators, the most famous of whom was a man named Hablo Brown, who used the pseudonym of Phiz. But we're reading the novel and we have a text, and we're imagining, I think most people who read the text imagine the scenes that are being described. And so we are free to construe a Miss Havisham however we choose. But the questions about bodily function and so on are appropriate questions for the film, but not for the novel, I think.
Okay.
And we are reading a text, and the vagueness and the potential for different versions of Miss Havisham, I think, depends on the fact that Miss Havisham is being seen and described by Pip. So it's Pip's imagination and Pip's experience of her that is what contributes to that mutability, that variation, that range of variation, and in Miss Havisham's appearance. And there's something spooky about this entire scene. It's taking place in the dark. It's taking place in a weird room. It's seen by a child who's never had an experience like this before in his life. Everything is new and strange, and it's a world that is opening up to him that is beyond his knowledge, beyond his understanding, and it's ghostly. Everything is happening in this strange, dark scene, and it's Miss Havisham is a ghost. I mean, among other things, she is a ghost, and Pip is experiencing her as if she were a ghost. So
Dickens accentuates that by having Pip repeat several times how he suddenly feels like a common laboring boy, that he suddenly feels different, that that he has been criticized. And I think it happens about 3 times in this portion, where he has come to this realization, which we know is important to the whole plot, but a film can't do that terribly well unless you have one of those
Go ahead.
things.
Someone mentioned miscasting of people. When I was in graduate school in 1967, which is 1,000 years ago, of Human Bondage was coming out. The only thing I remember about the movie is the harlot lady that keeps bothering that man. She's described as being skinny and of greenish hue. Skinny and of greenish hue. Now, that expression never left me. And then there was a full-page ad in the Times in 1967 of coming this fall of Human Bondage with Lawrence Harvey, and now for skinny and of greenish hue, Kim Novak. Now, Kim Novak is far from skinny, and she is very, very pink. So there is another version, as you know, of the movie where she really is the scoundrel, and I just recommend, if you are not sure you have depression, because we now have 988 we can read. You could either read Of Human Bondage or Jude the Obscure, and if you're not sure, if you don't commit suicide by the end of either of those novels, you're actually okay.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
It's Margaret here. I would like to make the observation that in this reading of Great Expectations, I thought of Dickens' writing as being so cinematic, that everything was so described. Like as an actor, you would get your cue from the very text, Dickens' text, of how you should move and how you should look, and that had never struck me before, because I'm in my 8th decade, and so I've been around a long time and have read the novel several times. But that was the main thing that struck me in reading the first 9 chapters, was how it all came to life in the words. And this is it's still a mystery to me of how this wonderful writer Dickens can paint such a vivid picture and give it to you, so that you take that as truth. And also I take Pip's voice, where he's first person narrator, but he's an older Pip looking back at the younger Pip, and he evokes so well, or brings to life so well, the young Pip. And that's just my observation about the filming and everything. But that Dickens as a filmmaker in his writing is that's what strikes me. And I'm sure scholars have written about it. I'm not a scholar. I'm just an enthusiast. But also, I would like to know what people's opinion is of what Pip's age is when he meets Magwitch and at the beginning of the novel. What is his age? Because he's on Joe Gargery's shoulders, and so he must be pretty small. And of course, he's never been to school. And of course, the school is introduced in those first 9 chapters as being a very, very elusive kind of thing.
That's a good question.
So,
Meckler
okay.
says that Pip is 7 in the first scene. And the only problem I have with that is that Pip says this was his earliest memory, clear notion of things, broad impression of the identity of things anyway. And it seems I know my first memory goes back to age 4. I know for a fact, my first day in kindergarten. So if he's 7, I said a tad on the old side. But I'd like to just add something about point of view here, which is marvelous in this novel. You might remember Dickens' earlier first-person novel, David Copperfield. And for example, the opening scene consists of the visit of Betsy Trotwood to Clara Copperfield, I think shortly after David is born. And David doesn't explain how he knows this in such detail. I may have missed something, but he narrates it as if he were there, but he narrates in the first person.
But his mother mentioned that, or he mentioned that his mother told him about her.
Yes, true. Yes. So he gives a sort of excuse later on. I wanted to point out a passage in this first chapter.
Wayne, if I could, I think we should acknowledge people who have used the raised hand function, and we have a couple of those. So Carl and then Linda. And if other people would like to use the raised hand function, we'll make sure to call on you. So Carl, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, I'm sorry to be a bit of a wet blanket, but I'm a great Dickens fan and I love the writing. I don't love the movies. The problem with the movies is they have to distill down the story from the writing, and you lose a great deal that way. So I generally avoid the movies and I turn to the text, and I hope we'll get to the text here.
Thank you. I think we should attend closely to the text. So Linda.
I had a question when we were talking about the film. I missed the illustrations. Why didn't Dickens work with an illustrator in Great Expectations?
The answer to that is mostly that this was published in a magazine, and the illustrations accompanied the monthly serializations that were published separately in their own intact format. And there were subsequent illustrations done by other illustrators, but they were, and there are later editions of Great Expectations that do have illustrations, but they are not illustrations that were done in collaboration with Dickens. And so we can see them as, like the films, as interpretations rather than as part of the original text. But Kathleen.
Yeah, could I jump ahead a little bit and ask people why they think he lied to his sister and Mr. what's his name about what he'd seen when he'd gone to see Miss Havisham? Why did he lie about it? You know, all this, oh, she was sat in a carriage and we were eating off gold and silver and the dogs ate off veal cutlets. Why did he do that? Does anyone know? Apart from being a 7-year-old boy, of course, who wanted to make it grander than it was.
Well, I'll jump in. Okay. One answer is that it's a case where Pip is protecting himself. He doesn't want to reveal what, for example, what Estella said, or you know what, how he felt about Estella. And a second possibility is that we know that children, like people in police interrogation, will say what they think their interrogator wants to hear. So Pip is, in a sense, entertaining his sister and Pumblechook, hoping that he won't get a beating out of it. So those are two possibilities anyway.
Well, and the third thing, what do we learn about Pip from this? We learn that he's capable of doing this sort of thing. Not only capable of lying, but capable of making up a whopping story that is maybe our first indication that maybe he's not just a poor little farm kid who doesn't know very much, right? That he does have an imagination. And we're advancing his character, I think, by discovering, because before that we just know that he likes Joe and is afraid of his sister and so on and so forth. But this advances who he is, I think.
And it's quite imaginative as well. His description of what happened is really quite imaginative for a young boy who growing up in the domestic environment he was in. All the coach and the gold and the silver and the food, and very clever. A lie, but very clever lie.
From the very beginning, he's assessing the world around him and trying to figure out what's most advantageous for him. And he's not quite sure where to land, because there are affectionate characters and then there are characters who have position and influence. And he's pulled back and forth between these two worlds and trying to figure out what is best for me. And so he does withhold information at times. Sometimes he lets his imagination go loose, and it's fantastic to hear his descriptions. But I think the part of the genius of the narration is that Dickens is able to tell the story through an adult of a childhood experience without feeling too much of that adult interpretation, which I think is very hard to do. And it's a bit of a trick that's, I think, is pretty remarkable.
I think that, can you remember when you first read this novel? I had such a powerful experience of it when I was in high school. It was assigned in high school. Most high school literature went right over my head. I didn't get it. But this was like a horror. This scene with Miss Havisham, I had nightmares about it, I mean, to me, because I was closer to Pip's age in a way, and I going into this, place, and this hag, this witch. That's why I think that Helena Bonham Carter is just, wasn't right for the role. I've never seen a good one, an excellent Miss Havisham. I just never have. But the other thing is the sense I get from the opening pages of this novel is he's just so beaten down, that sister of his, I mean, he's just like, and then he goes to this place and he's beaten down more, so the sense of worthlessness, but also this kind of horrific and powerfully fantastic scene, that's happened to him. It's like he takes control of it and makes it into another story. That's the way I see it. I mean, he kind of, like, he is defending himself. Somebody said protecting himself, but he's also, I don't know, assuming some kind of agency. He'll make it into his own story, and it's his own form of fantasy, which is not horror but kind of fun. So I think
Very
it's really
good.
Yeah.
Good observations, and I think it is a nightmarish scene. But let me call on Tiger and then Ernie, and I'd like to stick with this scene too, the scene where he tells Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook about his visit to see Miss Havisham. But Tiger, go ahead.
Hi people. I thought it was anger that made Pip tell the lies. He's got to be an angry little child from all the slaps, etc. And the experience he has of being verbally beaten up by the neighbor or whomever, and his sister has to make him a pretty angry little creature. And if you're that angry, you would not respect the people who are asking you. I think that might be part of it, not the whole story maybe, but that's what I was seeing. Thank you.
I think that's a very good observation. So, Cynthia.
I was
Oh,
just
yes, Cynthia, and then Ernie, if Ernie has gone away.
thank you. I was going to the text on this question, and in the Penguin edition at the bottom of page 70, when Joe asks Pip why he lied, Pip says, "I don't know what possessed me, Joe, but I wish you hadn't taught me to call knaves at cards jacks. And I wish my boots weren't so thick nor my hands so coarse." So that supports our discussion about his being protective and possibly angry.
Yes. So, Carl.
Finally learned how to raise my hand. I apologize for just jumping in before I finally found that thing. The last sentence of the book of chapter 9 is, "Pause, you who read this, and think of a moment of a long chain of iron or gold, of thorns and flowers that would never have bound you but for the formation of the first link of one memorable day." This reminds me enormously of listening to John Irving, because John Irving has been interviewed several times, and he says that his novels are based on a turning point in a book. So this is the one I'm thinking of is Owen Meany, where he hits a line drive and kills some lady, and that's the crux of the turning point of the entire book. The other thing is when Joe asks him about lying, makes me think of our modern day, because he's using a biblical statement. He says, lying comes from the fatherhood of lies, and you should never lie. I kind of think of the entire Congress and our whole society is based on the great teller of lies, meaning Satan. Anyway, that's when I read that, I just thought, well, lying is just part of Joe's a little naive in thinking that good people, particularly gentlemen, don't tell lies. Thank you.
I'd like to read the passage, and it's in chapter 9, and I have a different edition, so I can't give you the exact page, but it's in the middle of or about 3 pages into chapter 9. And it begins with a question from Uncle Pumblechook. And the question is, "Now, boy, what was she a doing of when you went in today?" asked Mr. Pumblechook. So if you have your edition, you can follow along, but I'll continue reading from that point. "She was sitting," I answered, "in a black velvet coach." Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another, as they well might, and both repeated, "In a black velvet coach?" "Yes," said I. "And Miss Estella, that's her niece, I think, handed her in cake and wine at the coach window on a gold plate. And we all had cake and wine on gold plates, and I got up behind the coach to eat mine because she told me to." "Was anybody else there?" asked Mr. Pumblechook. "4 dogs," said I. "Large or small?" "Immense," said I. "And they fought for veal cutlets out of a silver basket." Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another again in utter amazement. I was perfectly frantic, a reckless witness under the torture, and would have told them anything. Where was this coach, in the name of gracious? Asked my sister. In Miss Havisham's room. They stared again, but there weren't any horses to it. I added this saving clause in the moment of rejecting for richly compassionate couriers, of rejecting four richly comparisoned coursers, which I had wild thoughts of harnessing. Can this be possible, Uncle? Asked Mrs. Joe. What can the boy mean? I tell you, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook, my opinion is it's a sedan chair. She's flighty, you know, very flighty, quite flighty enough to pass her days in a sedan chair. Did you ever see her in it, Uncle? Asked Mrs. Joe. How could I, he returned, forced to the admission, when I never see her in my life, never clapped eyes upon her. Goodness, Uncle, and yet you have spoken to her? Why, don't you know, said Mr. Pumblechook testily, that when I have been there, I have been took up to the outside of her door, and the door has stood ajar, and she has spoken to me that way. Don't say you don't know that, Mum. Howsever, the boy went there to play. What did you play at, boy? We played with flags, I said. I beg to observe that I think of myself with amazement when I recall the lies I told on this occasion. Flags, echoed my sister. Yes, said I. Estella waved a blue flag, and I waved a red one, and Miss Havisham waved one sprinkled all over with little gold stars out at the coach window. And then we all waved our swords and hurrahed. Swords? Repeated my sister. Where did you get swords from? Out of a cupboard, said I, and I saw pistols in it, and jam and pills, and there was no daylight in the room, but it was all lighted up with candles. That's true, Mum, said Mr. Pumblechook with a grave nod. That's the state of the case, for that much I've seen myself. And then they both stared at me, and I, with an obtrusive show of artlessness on my countenance, stared at them and plaited the right leg of my trousers with my right hand. If they had asked me any more questions, I should undoubtedly have betrayed myself, for I was even then on the point of mentioning that there was a balloon in the yard, and should have hazarded the statement, but for my invention being divided between that phenomenon and a bear in the brewery. There was so much occupied, however, in discussing the marvels I had already presented for their consideration that I escaped. The subject still held them when Joe came in from his work to have a cup of tea. And then it moves into the discussion with Joe. So how much of this account is true? And what do you make of the fact that he is telling this to Uncle Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe? So, Sue, I see your
I don't know how to make the little hand icon appear, so I just put my.
I saw your hand. So
thank you. I think it's interesting. I think he maybe assumed that Uncle Pumblechook had actually seen her since he knew her, but once he found out that he hadn't, he figured he could tell any tale he wanted, and nobody could say, "Oh no, that's not right." And then as soon as he got started, I think it just kind of blossomed. I mean, he just kept thinking of new things to say.
So if you want to raise your hand, if you go down to reactions and click on that, you'll see that one of the things is that it says raise hand. Okay.
Okay.
I hope that helps.
Thank you.
So Ernie, and then Virginia, and then Glenna.
I just kind of, in reading it starts out, that passage is very, very imaginative by him, but it's almost like he's aggressively throwing this stuff out, because it starts out with Pumblechook pummeling him with these questions about math or arithmetic and stuff, and like being hit over the head, really. And then it seems to me he's just kind of sort of lashing out with his imagination, and he can, because like someone said, he probably thinks maybe they don't know much about her.
That fits with the suggestion that Tiger made, that Pip is angry at this point.
Yeah.
So yes, good observation. It's important that he's telling this to Uncle Pumblechook and to Mrs. Joe, which is Joe is not present in this scene. So
yeah, they're his tormentors, really.
Yeah. Virginia.
Yeah, so if you note before it started, Mrs. Joe slammed his head into the wall about 5 times when he got there till he had like, the stuff on his head. And then he says on page 66 of the Penguin version, I felt convinced that if I described Miss Havisham as my eyes had seen it, I should not be understood. Not only that, I felt convinced that Miss Havisham too would not be understood. And although she was perfectly incomprehensible to me, I entertained an impression that there would be something coarse and treacherous in my dragging her as she really was, to say nothing of Miss Estella, before the contemplation of Mrs. Joe. Like, he didn't want to tell her what it was really like because she's busy slamming his head into a wall, and he felt it would be unfair to her. So, he says he's going to, lie because he doesn't think they deserve to know what happened.
I want to call into question the idea that this is a lie. I mean, yes, it's not completely true, but I want to suggest that there's some truth in what he is telling. So I think it's too simple to call it a lie. Anyway, I'll plant that idea. And Glenna.
Well, I just wanted to say, it seems to me this is a classic case of a child who's been so beaten down, whose sense of self has been so eroded. And this gives him an opportunity to aggrandize himself to the people who are his chief tormentors, but also to himself. He needs to reestablish his own sense of self. I mean, we haven't even talked about Magwitch, and this is a child who's been terrified by Magwitch and then, has not had any capacity to establish a relationship of trust with any adult other than Joe, who doesn't have much power himself. And now this capacity to narrate a story that no one can challenge really and make himself into somewhat of a more important figure is too good to pass up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good observations. Yes, Barbara, and then Rick and Carl again.
Well, let's not also back to the anger theme. Let's not forget that he knows that he's been manipulated into this, right? Pumblechook and his sister are hope to gain somehow from having him associate with Miss Havisham, and he is a little pawn for them to try to get some sort of financial gain, and he's aware of that.
How deliberate is the story he tells? Is he doing it deliberately to get even with Mrs. Joe for having banged his head?
Well,
I have to say, it's a boy's own story. It's the kind of story you could expect a boy of 7 to tell. It's appropriate to character at that point. Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Okay. Rick. You need to unmute.
Okay, good. I think that probably Kath had it closest, that he really doesn't think they deserve a straight answer. It would be giving them something that they haven't earned. They sent him off in this situation, and so I think he's basically just doesn't think they deserve. But I think I'd like to move to another question, if I might. Why in the heck does Mrs. Joe adopt Pip in the first place? She doesn't seem to like him at all. He doesn't seem to be earning any thing to contribute much to the family, although they steal a little bit of money that he does. Really, anybody got an answer to why she would have adopted him?
Well, I can give you one answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
One is that in the 18th century, which is when this would have happened, or very early 19th century, it was not unusual for orphans to be taken in by close family members who would have felt probably an obligation to take in the children of a close family member who had died. So that was would not have been considered unusual. Somewhere in my research, I picked up some evidence that Squeaker, if you remember, Pumblechook calls Pip a squeaker or squealer.
Squeaker.
There's just a faint hint that maybe Chip is illegitimate. I don't know. Just a very faint possibility.
Carl?
I had another question too. that one dropped like a bomb. Why
No,
did
we can come back to the question of the family dynamics of this family, but so let's not let that question go away. So, David.
I think Pip really doesn't understand himself, his own feelings about Estella. But this is certainly not a subject that he wants to bring out to this particular audience. He says, as the adult narrator, that he doesn't want to expose Miss Havisham. And that's also complex emotion that he can't easily deal with. It's much easier to fabricate than to try and figure out how to talk about his emotions.
Yes. He wants to keep this experience to himself and not share it with people who will not only fail to understand it, but who will ruin it because something wonderful has happened to him that he doesn't fully understand. And he wants to keep that wonderful experience to himself. So he invents a cover story that has just enough truth in it, or that allows itself to be understood symbolically. I think we can say that the flags, and particularly the one that has stars sprinkled on it, somewhere there he's got Estella on his mind at that point, whose name, of course, means star. So there are many ways to understand this complicated story, but I think to see it simply as a lie is not sufficient. But Linda.
I was just going to say on why was he adopted?
Yes.
We're told it's Joe's idea, which, develops Joe further as this incredibly loving, good-hearted character. It's not his sister's idea.
I think that certainly is part of it. I mean, Joe is the loving parent. He's both a mother and a father to Pip. And what kind of mother is Mrs. Joe? I mean, the fact that we don't learn her first name, I think, is significant. Why is she just Mrs. Joe? I think in part it's because she's masculine. She's not conventionally maternal. She's not loving and warm and nurturing. All of her activities are angry, hostile, violent. Where she has breasts, she has an apron. And what is the apron? What's the apron like? The apron has pins where the breasts should be. I mean, Pip is someone who is brought up by hand. What does it mean to be brought up by hand? It means that he was bottle fed. Now, realistically, that's true because Mrs. Joe is not his actual biological mother. but she's almost an anti-mother with pins instead of breasts that a child can suck from. And when Pip gets fed, which is another maternal function, she cuts the bread by holding it up against her chest and taking a knife and cutting it as if she's cutting the child's throat. And then when you eat, you sometimes get pins in your mouth. So this is all fantastic, and yet at the same time, just sort of realistically, just barely plausible. So you need to read these scenes with all their full psychological implications. We've talked about Pip's anger, and we've talked also about the way in which he uses that Dickens is using point of view, because the language of this text is a very adult language, but the perspective, that is the point of view with the emphasis on view, how things are seen, is from the child's perspective. So it's an adult voice. If you look at the vocabulary, if you look at the diction, it's not a child's diction. It's not a child's language. It's a very adult perspective. The perspective is the child's perspective. The voice is the adult voice. So, Jan.
Jan, you're muted.
You need to unmute.
Sorry. What struck me about his story was Pip's character, and what we start to learn about his character first from the encounter with Magwitch. But this is particularly telling that there's a sense of nobility and chivalrousness in him. He's protecting two women that he doesn't understand and may not even like, but he knows somehow intuitively that Joe is a good person and these other two are not. The Mrs. Joe and the man. And it's a very touching scene that we're beginning to see who Pip really is, the beginnings of his character and how it's formed.
I think that's a very good observation. There is something chivalric about this, chivalrous, and the language of swords and sort of captures that sense of it as well. Pip has the adult Pip and even the young Pip are familiar with stories of romance, of knights in armor, and he's being a young knight in armor who's met a damsel and is starting to fall in love, and he wants to protect them, her in particular, I think Estella, and also to position himself in the role of the hero who protects. So we're learning something about the kind of person that Pip wants to be.
I'm not in charge, but Alexis has had her hand up for a long time.
Alexis, please.
Had a chance to talk, so
and Carl, you could take your hand down also.
Okay, I did want to say
Alexis.
Yeah, I want to get back to the idea of Pip being adopted. He's not adopted in any sense. His sister is 20 years older than him and an unmarried girl. And it would have been, she would have lost all status in the community if she had refused to take care of a little brother 20 years younger. And she meets Joe, and Joe says, oh, come to the fort and you can bring the little one with you. I'd be glad to have him. So she's not adopted or in any sense at all. She's sort of stuck with him. And Joe is very accepting of him as a little toddler.
Thank you. That's all very accurate, I think. So let's not, we can call Pip an orphan, but we can't call him adopted. Dan.
Yeah, so the episode with the lie, it succeeds a moment that comes after the Miss Havisham visit, but it's also a moment right after he meets with Estella in private where she brings him some food. And it's this moment of kind of corruption. And I guess you could probably see it as almost kind of permanent fall from grace, and this is the moment that kind of sparks this rupture in his character. And from then on, and he even kind of mentions it later on, this is where he kind of he can't really stabilize his identity to a point where he can tell the truth, or he can honestly kind of interpret it to a degree that he apply it in his own life. And this is kind of something where that story it's kind of supposed to demonstrate this sort of corruption of his character, I think. And he does in that moment when Estella kind of brings him the food and causes him to cry, and he kind of he says it's a smart without a name, and he also kind of refers back to immediately almost his mother's kind of bringing him up by jerks and really by hand as an injustice. And so I think that that ties into this as well. I mean, this is kind of the moment he's very much an abused child, and he's very much a sensitive and very vulnerable person, almost kind of to a morbid sense. And this is kind of this point in time, where early childhood that he can't escape this, and it's kind of to demonstrate that this moment of probably the word is corruption. It's a corrupted character moment in him that he can't really escape.
Interesting. What is the smart without a name? What do people think the smart without a name is? I think the young Pip can't put a name on it. The adult Pip doesn't put a name on it. I think we as readers have to put a name on it. A smart without a name. What is the smart without a name? Gail, I'll go to Gail. We still have other hands up. Alexis, I'm not sure if your hand is meant to stay up, but Gail, go ahead.
Gail, you're still muted.
The context of that quote, the smart without a name, I've lost the context of it. Where does it occur? John?
Dan, can you help us, because you're the one?
Yeah, it's right in chapter 8. It's leading into chapter 9, right before then, and it's right after he's met with Miss Havisham, kind of in private, but also with Estella there. And he's kind of in the garden, and I guess there's kind of a Garden of Eden connotation because Estella brings him some food. There's some bread and some water, and I guess some, meat or beer or whatever. And she kind of says, "Don't cry." This is the part where she says, "Don't cry, boy." And he basically kind of looks at her, and he says, "I'm not going to cry for you again." But of course, he weeps, really, almost in humiliation. And
it's on the top of page 63 in my Penguin. Top of page 63.
And he says it's a smart without a name, and he kind of I think it's really this humiliation that comes from kind of class consciousness, this idea that his boots are common, that he calls the knaves jacks, that he's basically a commoner that can't really escape that. And then in the eyes of these this kind of beautiful girl that he's obviously attracted to, it totally corrupts him. I think it permanently just ruptures his character to a point.
I think corruption's the right word. I think humiliation. I mean, what would be the truth if he came back and told the truth of his encounter at that sadist house? It would be more humiliation. It would be people who told him he was not okay, he was nothing, he was worthless. I mean, they play beggar my neighbor, right? He's the neighbor whose boots are too thick. He's common, of course, and he calls Jack's names. He couldn't tell the truth of it. So that's where this lie comes from. I don't think it's a fall or anything. I think it's defense. It's self-defense. I'm not this. I have got an imagination, and I can tell you my version of, what he would have liked to have happened, perhaps. Anyway, I'm defending Pip because I think he's an abused child is what somebody said he is.
Bill. And then Cynthia. And you'll need to unmute.
There we go, getting the unmute. I really like Dan's comment about corruption, and that ties back into Wayne's earliest comment, I think, about Miss Havisham being seductive. That there is an effort here to sort of draw Pip away from his background, and obviously Stella is sort of bait. he's brought there for her to practice seduction on, and that the scene in the ale house, I think, the beer garden, wherever it is that they were doing the brewing, is a central change to his character, in that, he sort of decides that I do have some loyalty to these people and that I need to protect them. I suspect he was something of a fabulist before that anyway, but I thought Dan's comment was very good.
Yes, good.
John, I was just reacting to your question about the word that the young Pip may have used, and I thought it was injustice. Because I don't know if you were thinking about this paragraph, the first full paragraph at the top of 63, my sister's bringing up had made me sensitive in the little world in which children have their existence. Whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's what is the injustice, though? Can you carry it just a step further? What's the nature of the injustice?
In Pip's little world, I think he knows he's not being treated fairly or with love. And he does say that Estella's treatment of him echoes his treatment by others, including Mrs. Joe.
Okay. I think much of it has to do with class. I mean, I think that humiliation, and Pip has never seen himself with the eyes of someone outside his own community. He doesn't know that Jax is the wrong word to use. He doesn't know that his hands are coarse. He doesn't know that his boots are a laboring boy's boots. He's never seen himself, and suddenly he is reflected in the eyes of someone whom he is attracted to and someone he admires, an adult from a different world. So much of this novel is about the experience of social class and the difference in social class. And there's so many subtleties to the way in which class is represented in these 9 chapters. I mean, and I have to apologize for something. I have a COVID booster appointment that I have to leave for in just a few minutes. I want to suggest that although this is a very rich moment, this Miss Havisham, Estella telling the story to Uncle Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe, although that's very rich, you need to talk about the opening scene of the novel. You need to talk about, and just a comment about the structure of these 9 chapters. There are 2 episodes. The first episode is the encounter with the convict and the theft of the food and the arrest of the 2 convicts. That's an episode that is complete and entire unto itself. And then the second episode, and that's chapters 1 through 5. And the second episode is chapters 6 through 9. And that too is a complete episode that ends with that wonderful concluding sentence about this is a turning point in Pip's life. And we've focused thus far entirely on the second episode. So I hope that in the remainder of this time, when I unfortunately have to leave, that you'll talk about the first 5 chapters as an entire episode. Not that we have exhausted because the part that we haven't talked about is when Joe says there wasn't even a puppy. Joe feels deceived by Pip's story. And Pip, in telling the story, in holding on to his experience and substituting this fabulous myth of flags and coaches, and fortunately took out the horses because the horses couldn't fit in the room. But but when he then reveals to Joe that it was an invention, a fabulous concoction, Joe can only see it as a lie and say, lies come from the father of lies. So he's, in telling that story and revealing that it wasn't entirely true, he's caused an injury to Joe. And he's opened up a breach between himself and Joe, because Joe believes that lies are lies and truth is truth. And Pip has violated that very basic ethical principle that Joe believes in. But Joe is incapable of understanding Pip in the fullness of Pip's complexity. So we have to see Joe, I think, in this moment as a good man, as a loving man, as the only loving presence in Pip's life up to this point, but also as limited in his understanding, limited in his understanding of Pip's potential, everything that makes it possible for Pip to tell that story. So anyway, that's just a few other thoughts. I'm sorry, I have to leave because I would love to stay with you, but I hope with Wayne's help that and the raised hand function, that people will be able to continue talking about this wonderful opening to this wonderful book. But again, my apologies, I have to go.
Oh, Carl, your hand is up?
Yeah. I want to contradict one thing John Jordan said. And boy, that takes a lot of chutzpah on my part, because he's the
you have it though.
I have chutzpah because I was brought up in the Bronx. He said raised by hand. He was raised with the tickler. I mean, he was raised by being beaten all the time. He was a product of child abuse. So being raised by hand to me is just the fact that he gets beaten up all the time. The other thing is about this story is I think he shows a lot of character, and he's somebody pointed out that his enemies, the bad people, were listening to the story. So he has it doesn't matter a damn thing what he's going to say happens to him, because they're not going to believe him anyway. So he has a great deal of power at this point to kind of basically say F you, in the sense that I'm going to make up a totally ridiculous story, because it doesn't really matter what story I tell. They're going to beat me enemy anyway and call me what I am. And the last thing I will say for the day, to your relief, is he's called a squealer. I think he's being referred to as a little pig. And anyway, that's it. So I'm out of your life for the rest of the day, and I enjoy the comments of everybody else in the discussion. Thank you.
That's great. I'd like to be sure we get on to the tremendous picture of child abuse and a dysfunctional family that Dickens gives us in these opening chapters. But Alexis, you had your hand up?
Alexis, you're still muted.
Oh, thanks.
I'm sorry. At the end of chapter 9, I just wanted to say he's talking about how different the course would have been if it weren't for this day. And he talks about the long chain of iron or gold that never would have bound you, but for the formation of the first link. And I was thinking of Ebenezer Scrooge and his first link that he forged. I think that's I don't know if there's other references to forging your link, but there's days in your life that somehow are set apart. And whether you have a choice in forging the link, or whether your personality just leads you to, is it a fatal error? Is it, what is it, when you forge your first link? And he has the one of gold and silver, and it's like a temptation, you know, the first temptation, there you are, and you fall for it. And I think it's a beautiful image with this thorns and flowers or silver and gold.
Yeah, that's great. I used to use this as a writing topic in high school, and I got a lot of responses like first day on a real job, learning experience in his life. Yes. And Rick, you had a hand up?
Yeah, there's another lie in this story that really surprised me, and that's when the convicts covered for him and actually acted as though they were the ones who'd broken in and stolen things. And where did that come from? Why would they let the boy off the hook like that when actually they could have very well thought that he was the one who turned them in? Is that to tell us something about class? Or what?
Well, one cheap answer is that Magwitch is a criminal with a heart of gold. And in that scene, Magwitch is contrasted with Compeyson, who keeps pointing finger at Magwitch, saying that he attacked me, he tried to kill me. And the other response I have is that Magwitch, in a sense, is saying thank you because Pip fed him, stole the food and brought it and fed it to him. But anyway, quick responses to your question.
David. You'll have
David,
to
you're still
unmute.
muted.
Wayne covered what I was going to say. Pip has been exchanging glances with Magwitch, saying, it's not me, it wasn't me. And Magwitch is trying to protect him.
Barbara?
Well, and he has told Magwitch about his sister already. You know, he has, and since we know from the rest of the book that Magwitch is, as Wayne said, a criminal with a heart of gold, and also, you know, perhaps already thinking about manipulating Pip into making him a gentleman. But he's genuinely protecting him. And then we get to have the whole business of how wrong-headed Pip is about all that for so long.
No spoilers.
No spoilers, right.
Well, having not read the rest of the book, like all of the rest of you, I didn't know some of the stuff you're coming up with now.
Kathleen?
Yeah, I think Magwitch didn't give Pip away. It was an act of kindness for kindness. Whether he'd been terrified into it or not, Pip had taken Magwitch the food and at it a great risk considering what Mrs. Joe was like, and the file. And as a sort of thank you for that, Magwitch took the blame because he knew that Pip would get into trouble for helping him. And I think it was just kindness for kindness. I hope that's what it was anyway.
Glenna?
Yeah. I'm unmuted now, I take it? Yeah. I think we should talk about the fact that this is one of the most stunning first chapters of any book I know. Just the whole setting of the scene, and he's a child, he's trying to, establish a sense of identity, looking at the gravestones of his departed family. And all of a sudden, out of the fog arises this terrifying figure. I mean, this is just, talk about, somebody earlier talked about cinematic. This is just one of the most stunning first chapters of any book I've ever read. And I just think we should take note of that fact.
I used to have a standard question for my students. The first chapter contains the instigating event of the novel. Based on just the first chapter, what do you think the rest of the novel will be about? And they all responded pretty capably, I thought, just projecting. Of course, unfortunately, some of them had all seen the David Lean movie, which is a real difficulty too. No. Yeah.
I'd just like to comment on kindness for kindness. I don't think Pip acted out of kindness. He was terrified. And Magwitch told him that he had to do it or he'd be punished. I forget what he said exactly. But Pip also is a good person and sort of went out of his way to help Magwitch. But I think it started with fear, not just kindness.
Absolutely. And Gail?
Am I coming through?
Yes. Yes.
Well, yes, I do think it started in terror, but then he went the extra mile. You know, he brought. Didn't he ask, "Are you enjoying it?" or something like that? I mean, there was some human contact there, and for that, I think Magwitch is covering for him. You know, he's protecting him, and I think, just to go back to the lie that he tells. I think this is such an unprotected child. Nobody except Joe is protecting him. Nobody is covering for him. He's so abused, you know. And what happens at Miss Havisham, I don't think that's so wonderful. I mean, he's just told you're not okay in further the social way. You didn't know that, did you? You just knew you weren't okay in yourself. I mean, I hate to be so psychoanalytic about this, and I'm not usually, but I just see him as so undefended. And this moment that Magwitch, is a defense of him. And when Pip comes back and tells that story, I think he's covering for himself. I think that, they're just forms of protection and self-protection to a very undefended child, a child who's just out there, and the opening scene, Glenn, is so right. I mean, that scene is absolutely terrifying. It's just more, it's beyond being non-protected. It's being threatened anyway, but he's also threatened in the home. That's what I think.
That's great. Well, Cynthia, did we get your hand?
I was supporting what Gail just said, because my sense was that Pip did not just bring food because he was terrorized, even though that is the case. Something happened between these two that turned out to be kindness, because as Gail was alluding to, Pip says, the adult Pip says, pitying his desolation, he said, "I am glad you enjoy it." And Magwitch said, "Did you speak?" "I said I was glad you enjoyed it." And then the tone changes and Magwitch says, "Thank you, my boy, I do." So I think a relationship happened between them.
I just want, Courtney, could we just for a minute go to my very last slide for some comic relief? Very last slide. No, it's not a big deal.
Yes. Sorry, I was just refreshing my cup of tea. Okay. Let me just pull this up.
Since we're on the pork pie. Oh, I'm sorry, second to last. It's the second to last then. Yeah, that's it. That's a pork pie. And I said a recipe available online. But maybe even in 1807, it would really, or 1812, it really would be something special. It's like the dessert for the Christmas dinner. And when Pip is stealing victuals, it's great. He says at one point, "Oh, I almost forgot the pork pie." So anyway, it's a Magwitch is really struck by the pork pie, shall we say. And Sue had a hand up. Sue, you're muted.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think there was sort of an instant kind of a positive relationship that was formed. I think Pip did more than just bring what he wanted, like a crust of bread and a piece of cheese and a file. Also, I think Magwitch was grateful, and I think at the moment that he was taken, he also realized that nothing worse could happen to him than was going to happen anyway. And so he might as well, save Pip all of this trouble and just tell the lie.
Very true. Very true. And let's see, David, I think you're next.
Okay. When we did this book last at the Universe, John asked a question that nobody ever answered, which was, what is the most important sentence in the book? And I am belatedly going to answer that and suggest that the sentence is said by Joe, and that Joe has formed Pip's values. When Magwitch is apologizing for having broken in and stolen things, Joe says, "We wouldn't have you starve to death for it. Poor miserable fellow creature." And I think some of that is in Pip's attitude, and it's important.
Bill, you have your hand up.
Oh, yes. I was going to say that there seems to be a difference in perception in the way that Pip bringing the gift to Magwitch is thought of on the two sides. That Pip does seem to be doing it because he's terrified of Magwitch. Then again, I assume he's used to getting threats. On the other hand, Magwitch is deeply grateful, and frankly seemed a little surprised that it actually worked. That somebody showed up not just with food but with dessert as well and a file. So his reaction to the event seems different than Pip's. Essentially, Pip was forced into it, but Magwitch does seem is grateful.
I just wanted to add that I think Pip takes delight in stealing from his sister and taking the things that the convict didn't ask for. I think there's some delight there in causing her some pain.
Taking it to the man.
Yeah, exactly.
I particularly like the tar water and the brandy.
Well, I want to talk about tar water, if it's okay. Anyone want to get into a footnote on tar water? It is not made with petroleum product, as we might think. Tar water would have been made with a rendered resin, pine resin. That's why Pip says Joe and I smell like a new fence, because tar sealant made from resin would be used to seal fences. But, and I won't go on and on. Curiously enough, the philosopher Bishop Berkeley had promoted tar water as an all-purpose medicine in the 18th century. But it's clear that Pip knows from the book, it acted, among other ways, as a laxative. So Mrs. Joe, in administering tar water, is basically administering a laxative both to Pip and Joe. So if you are classical Freudian, you will think this is one very sick lady. I also, though, wanted to get to the picture of child abuse in these chapters, which I think could be a case study for any psychologist or psychiatrist. It is, I think, marvelous. Not the least because I usually have to go against people about Joe Gargery. To me, he is one of the scariest characters in the novel because he does nothing. And I say that with some anger because we know in cases of real child abuse, a spouse knows it's happening and does nothing. Excuse me, even in some cases where the child is killed. So yes, I have trouble with Joe. And of course, he gives an elaborate excuse to Pip for why he doesn't really protect Pip from Mrs. Joe. But I do have to open that up. It's so easy to say that Joe is wonderful. Well, maybe. But he certainly does not act on his better feelings, I feel. Anyone want to defend Joe? He, as I said, he gives a reason. This is, again, I think, is a wonderful case study in child abuse. Oh, Bill.
One of the things I was surprised by in reading the book this time is the extent to which Joe seems a limited person. That he seems, I'm not certain if he's unintelligent or autistic or, but he's not quite all there in modern parlance. And I had never noticed that in previous readings or previous versions of the book. And your comment about being angry, I guess I hadn't felt that way because I felt he was as much a victim. Mrs. Joe married him because he's a blacksmith. He has a blacksmith shop. He is, in their world at least, relatively successful. And he, in my thoughts, he's as much a victim as Pip is, and which is sort of, we see them as allies during this part of the book. So I guess my reaction to that relationship was a little different than yours.
Well, just a quick reaction. That also is so true to life. Sometimes the spouse or parent who knows the abuse is going on, and this would include sexual abuse of little girls, knows it's going on, but their plea, well, it may not be a plea, is that they too were abused or would have been more abused if they had done something about it. That's usually the response that if Joe were put on the stand, might give.
Mm-hmm.
And see, Glenna, you were next.
Well, there's this whole thing of an abused spouse who's got an abused child. They're so beaten down themselves. They're a deer caught in the headlights. But I think, Wayne, I think that what you said is really, really fascinating. It's food for a lot of thought about, and I don't want to issue any spoilers, about subsequent developments in the novel if we don't see Joe as entirely saintly, but as a more complicated character. I think that's a really fruitful line of thinking to engage in. So thanks.
Thank you very much. And David, you had something.
Joe is a survivor of child abuse himself and sort of has the habit of powerlessness.
And Catherine too?
I thought, yeah, I was also really upset about the fact that Joe didn't do anything to protect Pip, but I also see that he is a victim too. And I think even Pip says a couple times, like, you know, we both were brought up by hand. I think he says that at one point. So indicating that they both have gotten physically abused. And in a lot of ways, Joe is really childlike. You know, he doesn't seem to take the position of the adult in the family. That seems to be all Mrs. Joe's responsibility. But I think what Joe does is like he tries to he doesn't find a way out of the situation, but he tries to make it as good as he can for Pip by giving him so much love and affection, and you know, saying that we're ever the best of friends. And then another thing he does that's a little unnerving is he tries to reframe the situation for Pip when he says, you know, she was a fine woman or whatever. And to me, that part is like really off-putting. Like he says that about Mrs. Joe even later. And it's like, well, why are you, it's kind of gaslighting in a way to say she was a fine, we all know she wasn't a fine woman, you know, but he wants it to be a nice story for Pip. So I think he's trying, you know, I think he loves Pip dearly, but you know, he's limited like we all are.
It's a little trace of Dickens' comedy too. Joe says several times, she were a fine figure of a woman. And you've got to be thinking, what? I don't think so. Certainly not in the early 19th century, she isn't. Virginia?
I was going to say too, it's important that we're looking at child abuse through the lens of today, where it's appalling and nobody does. But if you think of the time period, kids were being beaten all the time. They were beaten at school. They were beaten in boarding school. You know, this was a common thing of spare the rod and spoil the child. So for Joe, he may have been raised, and certainly Mrs. Joe isn't, you know, afraid to beat him up as well, and you know, smack him around. That it's more a way of life. And so it's hard to look at it through our lens of how we would feel about that. And it makes us angry, but it's not reflective of the time. Kids were beaten a lot in those times. In a lot of Dickens books, you read about all the abuse, because that it was just accepted. You know, this is what we do. We beat kids, we put them to work in factories. You know, they weren't living the childhood that kids live today.
Yes.
So I think that's important to keep.
Nicholas Nickleby, Squeers, has actually been somewhat crippled by the beatings he received at Do the Boys School. The other thing in connection with this, at the Christmas dinner, there is a little more of Dickens' comedy when Pip is subjected to general denunciation by everyone but Joe. Why are the young never grateful? And that is reflecting very much the period, 1807, when, as you say, children were believed to have be born with natural depravity, and naturally vicious. One of Dickens' characters says that. And it required sometimes some beating to beat out the devil from the child, yes. I'm sorry, go ahead. Someone?
I'm sorry, I was just... I was just going to say that while it might have been the standard of the time, you always get the feeling Dickens didn't approve.
No.
He himself was beaten as a child and was put to work. And in his books, these are always treated as recognized that they're the standard of the day, but that they're wrong. It's one of the reasons I think why Dickens has always been so compelling.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Yes. Oh, let's see, Gail.
So when Joe calls her a fine figure of a woman, I think that's the way he sees her. I mean,
but
you have to ask, what is it? What is it that he sees in her? And you know, he himself comes from an abused. You know, he was raised by hand, so he's just replicating the conditions of his childhood. You know, he's sort of an abused child himself in this situation, which I think exonerates him somewhat. I really think he's doing the very best he can, the very best of friends, you know. he's just lending his emotional support there. But
They're for the
he's
best of friends.
ever the best of her, but he's quite helpless and he's a bit of a simpleton, really.
Yes.
But in a way, one of these kind of oh gosh, what's the novel? The Idiot by Dostoevsky or something, this saint-like simpleton,
Idiot savant.
Yeah, well, that's a lot. He's not
Idiot savant.
yeah.
Yeah, and Barbara, you had a hand up too.
Yeah, I just want to double back on what Virginia said. We can't really put the modern day beliefs onto everything in this novel. And to bring it up to date, there are still several schools in Ireland that there is still caning going on in schools. I read the statistics that I read about it because there was a big headline in the Guardian saying that one of the schools had decided to stop caning, but then they listed all the others that still are doing it. So children are still being hit with whips.
But Barbara, are they being forced to take laxatives? That's the question. Are they missing out?
I have a nasty answer for that, but I'll keep quiet.
No, Dan. Dan left.
Yeah, David.
Dan.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. David had mentioned it earlier, but yeah, Joe is a victim of abuse as a child. He and his mother having to run away from his father. And it's in that same conversation that he actually discusses with Pip by the fire that, the sister that, Pip's sister that he married is a fine figure of a woman. And so it's odd that, he would be this victim of abuse and also perceive the abuse done by the sister, but in the same sense. And I don't think it's gaslighting. I think he actually he's professing his love for, his sister. I mean, Joe really loves Pip's sister, Mrs. Joe. And I think that's something that is really at the seat of a lot of Pip's identity is this idea that Joe can't really help but love his, the sister. And that is a very conflicting emotion for Pip, and also kind of something that I think develops throughout the story. But yeah, I mean, it's this cycle of abuse that doesn't really ennoble the victim so much as it really kind of drags them down in some ways to a point of helplessness, and also kind of problematic perpetuation of the same cycle. So,
of course, one of the problems with an abused child is that he or she will sometimes blame herself for the abuse. That's part of the psychology of childhood is taking on the responsibility or the guilt for the way they're being treated, and that's serious. I think Dickens is again so wonderful in showing how I think both Joe and Pip, to some extent, well, the essayists say need to be punished, but at least own some of that abuse, shall we say, to use a modern word, take responsibility for it themselves.
Yeah.
And David, you too?
Yes. What you just said is absolutely right. There's this cause and effect in a child's mind. I'm being punished, so I must have done something wrong. But what prompts me to speak is a current news story. Children who were in this country as a result of their parents having come here illegally are being put to work in the middle of the night by companies like Tyson and Purdue, cleaning blood and chicken fat off of the machinery in factories that cut up chicken parts. We think of child labor as being something that we've gotten past. It isn't.
Sure, go ahead.
I just want to say that all this beating down, the abuse, you're not okay, internalizing it, I'm not okay. I mean, it really accounts for so much of the rest of it, where he has to be somebody else. He's not good enough to himself, and so this fantasy of becoming a gentleman seizes his imagination and just won't let go. He just has to be somebody else, which of course, is a huge problem for anybody. But I think it starts here in this groundwork of humiliation. And Miss Havisham continues that humiliation. And Estella, they are all, you're not okay as you are. Only Joe says you're okay as you are. But feebly,
John recommended more attention to the first chapter. There's just one passage I wanted to point out about Dickens' first person point of view here and how very deft it is. It's on the second page of chapter 1. And I'll just read it here. "Hold your noise," cried a terrible voice, as a man started up from among the graves at the side of the church porch. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." A fearful man, all in coarse gray, with a great iron on his leg. A man with no hat, and with broken shoes, and with an old rag tied round his head. A man who had been soaked in water, and smothered in mud, and lamed by stones, and cut by flints, and stung by nettles, and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Don't cut my throat, sir." But I wanted to ask you about that description of Magwitch. Who is narrating here? Pip or Mr. Pirrip, or some combination of both?
Well, I read recently that Dickens wrote a letter saying that he thought his introduction to this book was very droll.
Droll. Yes.
I don't see it.
I would usually begin the book with high schoolers. I'd have one of the big football players read Magwitch's part, and I would play the part of terrified Pip. So it kept the boys' attention. They weren't amused, but it was fun for me anyway. But droll. But is that Pip describing Magwitch on first sight? Is that really all Pip describing them, giving us a little history of Magwitch right there in that description?
Well, as John said, the point of view is not the voice of the novel.
No.
Voice of the novel is mature, and the point of view is not, which is terrific. I mean, you get the best of both. When you think of
absolutely,
you get this childhood imagination, and that's another terrifying. Miss Havisham follows. He's also terrifying. This kid, and I go back to my high school experience with this book. Really like, unprotected. Ironically, he ends up being protected in a way that is totally beyond his imagination. His very active imagination does not for a second conceive of what's coming. No spoilers. But anyway, yeah. And the other thing is he's in the graveyard, and there are his parents under the earth.
Mm-hmm.
It is where your parents there. And I mean, that's the dead rising, before him, as though, I mean, that was my childhood conception of it when I read the novel the first time. Oh my God, this person rises out from among the graves. It's absolutely terrifying. And anyway, it's just more unprotectedness, that Pip has to find his own way. And he's so confused because he just doesn't know he's not worthy. He wants to be a gentleman because that's how you become worthy. Anyway, we have a long way to go this novel, many miles.
For the historian, it's a wonderful picture of infant mortality in 1812.
Right.
All his brothers and sisters, or brothers, are dead.
Yeah.
And I'm running out of juice here, but I love it at the bottom of page 5 in my book. It's about 3 pages into the first chapter. We hear Pip say, "Get me a file." He tilted me again. "And you get me victuals." He tilted me again. "And bring them both to me." He tilted me again. "Oh, have your heart and liver out." He tilted me again. I was dreadfully frightened and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands and said, "If you would kindly please to let me keep upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick, and perhaps I could attend more." Now, this way a 7-year-old working class boy would talk? That's my question. Alexis has a hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the middle of all this graveyard imagery, there's still humor, because he visualizes his little brothers, his little dead brothers, as lying on their back with their hands in their trouser pockets, you know.
Yeah.
And like Magwitch is threatening. He says, "Oh, what plump cheeks you have! I'll just eat them." You know, he's not going to do that. But the little boy doesn't know that he's not going to eat his plump little cheeks. You know, parts of it, you know, really are quite funny.
And Bill, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I remember reading that initial description and thinking it was really interesting, but had nothing to do with what Pip actually saw. Right? You described it as actually being the guy's life's history, you know, how he escaped, he had to crawl through the mud, and how he cut his hands. But I remember reading it and saying, well, you know, if I had sort of been there, it's like, oh, there's a guy with, you know, dark hair covered with mud. And those things are only sort of mentioned in passing. And that most of the description actually is, you know, what happened to Magwitch between the time he left the prison, or actually perhaps while he was on the prison, and the time he arrived in the graveyard, sort of rendered as descriptions of his appearance. So yes, your comment that it's actually his life's history, or some portion of it, is illuminating.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And every time I read Dickens, it's so much better than I remember. It gets better every time.
Yes, this is my second Dickens book in 2 months, and it's like, yeah, these are really good.
There aren't too many things in life like that. They get better every time. Well, folks, I'm at 5 o'clock Central, so I want to thank you all for attending and for your wonderful comments. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Wayne.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you, Wayne.
Good to see you all.
Thank you.
See you next month.
For sure.